They make you stand before the church while the priest throws dirt on your feet. Be dead to the world, he intones, his voice echoing off the stone walls. Be reborn in God. The congregation watches from a safe distance. Your wife, your children, your neighbors, everyone you have ever known. They watch as the priest performs your funeral rites, speaks the words that commend your soul to heaven, treats you in every way as if you were a corpse. But you are not dead. You are standing there, breathing, your heart beating, your mind screaming. You are alive, and you will remain alive for years, perhaps decades. But from this moment forward, you are no longer a person. You are a leper, one of the living dead, cast out from human society forever. The priest hands you your new possessions: a gray cloak, a pair of gloves, a wooden clapper or bell. These are the marks of your condition, the uniform of your exile. From now on, you must wear them always. From now on, you must announce your presence wherever you go, warning the healthy to flee, marking yourself as contamination walking. Welcome to the medieval leper colony. Before we go any further, I need you to do something for me. If you're new to this channel, hit that subscribe button and tap the bell icon so you never miss another journey into historical darkness. And if you're already subscribed, you know the drill. Leave a like on this video. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. It helps more than you know, and honestly, even lepers had more social connection than the YouTube algorithm gives me. Now, where were we? Ah, yes. You've just been declared dead while still alive, and your journey to the leprosarium is about to begin. Leprosy, known today as Hansen's disease, was the most feared illness of the medieval world. Not because it killed quickly. It didn't. Not because it was highly contagious. It actually isn't. But because it destroyed the body slowly, visibly, horribly, turning human beings into something that no longer looked human. And because the medieval mind saw in leprosy something worse than mere disease, the visible mark of sin, God's punishment made flesh. The leper colonies, leprosariums, lazar houses, leper hospitals that dotted medieval Europe were not hospitals in any modern sense. They were places of exile, communities of the damned, where those diagnosed with leprosy were sent to live out their days apart from healthy society. Some were well-funded institutions with stone buildings and regular meals. Others were little more than shacks outside town walls, where the afflicted begged for survival. Over the next few hours, we're going to explore what it meant to live in these places. The diagnosis that ended your former life. The ritual that declared you dead. The rules that governed your existence. The daily reality of a disease that consumed your body piece by piece. And perhaps, unexpectedly, the moments of community, faith, and even peace that some lepers found in their exile. This is the brutal reality of life in a medieval leper colony. Get comfortable. The bell is ringing. Began with something small. A patch of skin that looked different, paler, or perhaps reddish, slightly raised. You noticed it one morning while dressing, or perhaps your wife noticed it, her fingers pausing on your back, her voice careful as she asked, "What is this?" You told yourself it was nothing. A rash, a bruise, an insect bite. It would fade in a few days. Everyone got skin blemishes. It didn't mean anything. You went about your work, your life, pushing the small fear to the back of your mind. But the patch didn't fade. It grew slowly, almost imperceptibly. And then you noticed something worse. You couldn't feel it. When you touched the pale skin, there was no sensation, as if that part of your body belonged to someone else. The numbness spread to your fingers, perhaps, or your feet. You burned yourself on a cooking pot and didn't notice until you smelled the scorched flesh. Now the fear grew harder to ignore. Everyone knew the signs of leprosy. Everyone had seen lepers on the roads, heard their bells, watched healthy people scatter at their approach. The pale patches, the numbness, the slow disfigurement, these were common knowledge, whispered about in taverns, preached about in churches. Leprosy was God's curse made visible, and its signs were unmistakable. You hid it as long as you could. You wore longer sleeves, kept your hands hidden, made excuses for your clumsiness when the numbness made you drop things. Your wife knew, how could she not? But she said nothing, maintaining the fiction that everything was normal, that your family was not about to be destroyed. The hiding couldn't last forever. A neighbor noticed. A priest observed. A physician was consulted. The machinery of medieval diagnosis began to turn, and once it started, there was no stopping it. Soon, you would stand before the examiners, your body stripped and inspected, your fate decided by men who saw in your flesh the evidence of your sin. The examination was thorough, humiliating, and often performed by people with no real medical knowledge. In theory, physicians were supposed to diagnose leprosy. In practice, priests, local officials, or even juries of existing lepers might be called upon to examine suspected cases and render judgment. You stood naked, or nearly so, before the examiners. They inspected every inch of your skin, looking for the telltale patches, the nodules, the thickening that might indicate leprosy. They pricked your skin with needles, testing for the numbness that was considered a definitive sign. They examined your eyes, your ears, your voice. Leprosy could affect all of these, and hoarseness or a distinctive nasal voice might contribute to the diagnosis. The examiners looked for other signs too. They might take a sample of your blood, examining it for abnormalities they believed indicated the disease. They might check your sweat, your urine, your pulse. Medieval medicine was a mixture of observation, tradition, and superstition, and leprosy diagnosis reflected all three. Some examinations were more rigorous than others. In well-organized cities, trained physicians followed established protocols. In rural areas, the parish priest might simply look at the suspicious patches and declare, "You unclean," based on what he'd heard about leprosy, rather than any real knowledge. The quality of your examination could depend entirely on where you lived. The diagnosis was not always accurate. Other skin conditions, psoriasis, eczema, syphilis in later periods, could be mistaken for leprosy. Some people were sent to leprosariums who didn't have the disease at all, condemned to live among the truly afflicted, possibly contracting the illness they had been falsely accused of having. Others with genuine leprosy might be missed if their symptoms were mild or atypical. But accuracy was almost beside the point. Once you were examined, once the suspicion was raised, your reputation was already destroyed. Even if declared clean, you might be watched, suspected, excluded. And if declared unclean, if the examiners found what they were looking for, your old life was over. If you're enjoying this journey into medieval affliction, take a moment to hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow, and I promise the diagnosis is only the beginning of the darkness. The word, when it came, was simple and devastating: unclean. In that single word, Everything you had been was erased. Your profession, your property, your family relationships, your place in society, all of it ended. You are no longer a baker or a farmer or a craftsman. You are no longer a husband or a father or a son. You were a leper, and that identity swallowed all others. The legal consequences were immediate and severe. In many jurisdictions, lepers were considered legally dead. You could not inherit property or pass property to your heirs. Contracts you had signed might be voided. Your marriage might be dissolved, or your spouse given the option to leave you. Your children might be taken from you, given to relatives to raise, protected from the contamination you represented. Some of these consequences varied by time and place. The medieval period spanned centuries, and different regions had different customs. Some areas were relatively lenient, others were draconian. But everywhere, the diagnosis of leprosy meant exclusion, separation, the end of normal human life. The theological interpretation was perhaps worse than the legal. Leprosy was widely understood as divine punishment, God's judgment, made visible on the sinner's body. What sin had you committed to deserve this fate? The question would follow you forever, whispered by others, echoed in your own mind during sleepless nights. Even if you could think of no great sin, the evidence was written on your flesh. God did not make mistakes. You might have a few days to settle your affairs, to say goodbye to family, to make arrangements for property, to prepare for the journey ahead. But time was limited. The healthy community wanted you gone, wanted the contamination removed from their midst. Soon, the ritual would begin that would formally separate you from the world of the living. The Mass of Separation was a funeral for someone who hadn't died yet. It was performed in churches across medieval Europe, with variations in detail, but remarkable consistency in meaning. The leper was being expelled from human society and symbolically committed to the grave. The ritual often began with a leper standing at the church door, not permitted to enter the sacred space with the healthy congregation. In some versions, the leper knelt in a grave-shaped trench dug in the churchyard, a living person in a symbolic tomb. The priest performed the full funeral mass, the same prayers and readings that would be spoken over an actual corpse. Remember that you are dust, and to dust you shall return. The words of Ash Wednesday took on terrible new meaning when spoken to someone still breathing, still conscious, still desperately alive. Dirt was thrown on the leper on the feet, symbolizing that they were dead to the world. Black cloths might be draped over them, as over a coffin. The congregation sang funeral hymns. Prayers were offered for the soul of the departed. The entire ritual insisted, again and again, that the person undergoing it was no longer among the living. Then came the pronouncement of the prohibitions. The priest would read out the rules the leper must follow. Never enter a church, a mill, a bakery, a market. Never touch a child or give anything to a child. Never touch common wells, common paths, common anything. Never go anywhere without the leper's garments and the bell or clapper. Never speak to anyone downwind. Never eat or drink with healthy people. The list went on and on, a comprehensive catalog of exclusion that governed every aspect of life. The leper listened, perhaps numb with shock, perhaps weeping, as their entire future was defined in negatives: never, never, never. Finally, the priest handed over the equipment of exile, the cloak, the gloves, the bell. Go, he might say, and never return. If you're settling in for the night, now's a good time to hit that subscribe button and leave a comment, because we're about to explore the rules that governed every moment of a leper's existence. The rules varied somewhat from place to place, but their purpose was always the same: to prevent any contact, any contamination, any possibility that the leper's disease might spread to the healthy community. The rules transformed lepers into untouchables, people who could not participate in normal human society in any way. Lepers could not enter churches. The house of God was for the living, for the spiritually and physically clean. Some leprosariums had their own chapels. Others had special windows, or leper squints, through which lepers could watch Mass from outside. But the main church, the community's spiritual center, was forbidden. Lepers could not use common facilities. They could not drink from public wells or fountains. Their touch would contaminate the water. They could not wash in common streams. They could not enter mills to grind their grain, bakeries to buy bread, markets to purchase goods. Everything they needed had to be obtained at a distance or provided by the leprosarium. Lepers could not touch or approach healthy people. If a healthy person was coming, the leper had to ring their bell and step off the road, waiting at a distance until the healthy person passed. They could not touch children under any circumstances, a rule that must have been agonizing for lepers who were parents. They could not give anything directly to a healthy person. When lepers spoke to healthy people, they had to stand downwind, so their breath would not carry the disease. They pointed with a stick rather than a finger. They carried their own cups and bowls, their own eating utensils. Every rule reinforced the same message: you are contamination. Your very existence is dangerous. Stay away. The leper's bell, or in some regions, a wooden clapper, was the most distinctive marker of the disease. It was a sound that meant danger, contamination, death walking. When people heard it, they knew to move away. The bell was not large or melodious. It was a small, harsh-sounding instrument, designed to be heard clearly, but not to create beautiful music. Some lepers carried actual bells. Others had wooden clappers that made a distinctive clacking sound. The specific instrument varied by region and era, but the function was the same: to announce the leper's presence before they came into view. The leper was required to ring the bell constantly while moving in public spaces, walking down a road, approaching a town. Anywhere that healthy people might be encountered, the bell had to sound, warning everyone to clear a path, to avoid contact, to protect themselves from the walking plague. Imagine what this meant psychologically. Every step you took was accompanied by a sound that identified you as dangerous, as diseased, as outcast. You could not move quietly through the world, could not blend in, could not pretend for even a moment to be normal. The bell proclaimed your status constantly, turning you into a spectacle of contamination. The bell also served as a begging tool. Lepers who were not in well-provisioned leprosariums often had to beg for survival. They would ring their bells outside town walls, at crossroads, at church doors, hoping that charitable Christians would throw them coins or food. The same sound that drove people away might also, paradoxically, attract their charity. Some lepers resented the bell bitterly. It was the audible form of their humiliation, the sound that made their exclusion complete. Others may have found it practical, even protective. It kept them from accidentally violating the rules, kept them from getting too close to people who would react with fear and violence. However they felt about it, The bell was their constant companion. The clothing of a leper was as distinctive as the bell, marking them visually, just as the bell marked them audibly. A leper could be identified from a distance by their garments, giving healthy people time to avoid them. The cloak was typically gray or black, a somber color that matched the leper's social death. It was long, covering the body completely, hiding the disfigurements that the disease might have caused. In some regions, a hood was required, pulled up to shadow the face. The leper became a shapeless, anonymous figure, human in outline only. Gloves were mandatory, covering the hands that could not be trusted to avoid touching things they shouldn't touch. The hands were often where leprosy became most visible. The fingers might be twisted, shortened, ulcerated, clearly marked by disease. The gloves hid this evidence while also providing a physical barrier between the leper's flesh and the world. Some regions required additional markers, a special badge sewn to the cloak, often in the shape of a hand or a T for tau, a symbol associated with leprosy. The badge made identification even easier, even from a distance too great to see the face or hands clearly. The clothing served multiple purposes. It protected the healthy from contamination, or at least from the fear of contamination. It protected the leper from the worst of the elements, since many lived outdoors or in poorly heated buildings. And it enforced conformity, ensuring that all lepers looked the same, their individual identities subsumed into the collective identity of leper. For a newly diagnosed leper, putting on these garments for the first time must have been a profound moment. The familiar clothes of their former life, the working clothes, the Sunday best, the items that expressed personality and status, were gone. In their place was the uniform of exile, worn by every other leper, erasing individuality in favor of disease. After the separation mass. After the rules were pronounced and the equipment provided, the leper had to make their way to the leprosarium. For many, this journey was the loneliest walk of their lives. The leprosarium might be nearby, just outside the town walls, or it might be miles away in the countryside. The leper walked there. There was no other option for most wearing their new gray cloak, ringing their bell, watching people scatter at their approach. Everything familiar receded behind them. Everything ahead was unknown. Some lepers were accompanied by family members for part of the journey, a last act of love before the final separation. Others walked alone from the start, the community wanting nothing more to do with them. Either way, the leper eventually arrived at their destination alone, presenting themselves at the gate of their new home. The journey was also a spiritual one. Medieval Christianity emphasized that earthly suffering could purify the soul, preparing it for heaven. The walk to the leprosarium was framed as a pilgrimage, a journey toward God rather than away from human society. The leper was encouraged to accept their fate as divine will, to embrace their suffering as a form of penance. Whether lepers actually felt this way is hard to know. The spiritual framework was provided by healthy priests and theologians, not by lepers themselves. Some may have found genuine comfort in the idea that their suffering had meaning. Others surely felt only the bitterness of exile, the unfairness of a fate they had done nothing to deserve. At the leprosarium gate, the leper's old life officially ended. They entered a new world, with new rules, new companions, new expectations. Whatever they had been before, rich or poor, educated or illiterate, sinner or saint, they were now simply a leper among lepers. The leprosarium was a self-contained community, a village in miniature, designed to house people who could not live anywhere else. Within its walls or fences, or merely its understood boundaries, lepers lived, worked, prayed, and died together. The layout varied considerably. Well-endowed leprosariums, often established by wealthy donors or religious orders, might have substantial stone buildings, dormitories, a chapel, a refectory for meals, an infirmary for the sickest patients, storage buildings, workshops. Poorer leprosariums might be little more than a collection of wooden huts, barely sheltered from the elements. The chapel was usually the finest building, reflecting the emphasis on spiritual care for the lepers' souls, even as their bodies decayed. It was often positioned so that lepers could attend services while still remaining separated, perhaps with a wall dividing the lepers, section from a section for healthy visitors, or with the leper window allowing observation from outside. Dormitories housed the lepers, sometimes in individual cells, more often in common rooms with beds or pallets arranged in rows. Privacy was minimal, as it was throughout medieval society. You slept, dressed, and lived in close proximity to your fellow lepers, united by the disease that had brought you all there. The grounds often included a cemetery, a vegetable garden, perhaps some animals for food or labor. The leprosarium aimed for self-sufficiency where possible, since yachting goods from the outside world was complicated. Some leprosariums had their own mills, their own bakeries, their own workshops, everything needed to sustain life without contact with the healthy. A wall or fence typically surrounded the compound, marking the boundary between the leper world and the normal world. The wall kept lepers in and kept unwanted visitors out, though its primary function was symbolic. This was a separate space, operating by separate rules, inhabited by a separate category of people. If you're still with me in the leprosarium, take a moment to hit subscribe. Your support helps me create more historical deep dives for your bedtime listening. And speaking of routine, let's explore what daily life was actually like. Life in the leprosarium followed a rhythm, structured around prayers, meals, work, and rest. The structure provided order, gave days a shape, kept the inhabitants from simply sitting and waiting for death. The day began early with prayers. Lepers who could walk assembled in the chapel. Those too sick rose in their beds at the same hour. The liturgical cycle of medieval Christianity matins, lauds, prime, and the other canonical hours marked the passage of time. For many lepers, these prayers were the spiritual core of their existence, the connection to God that made their suffering meaningful. Meals were taken communally in the refectory, or in the dormitories for those too ill to move. The food was simple but adequate in well-run leprosariums. Bread, pottage, vegetables from the garden, occasionally meat or fish. Some leprosariums had good endowments that provided decent nutrition. Others were always on the edge of hunger. Work occupied much of the day for those capable of it. Lepers tended the garden, cared for animals, maintained the buildings, performed whatever tasks they could manage. Work was encouraged both for practical reasons. The leprosarium needed labor, and for moral ones. Idleness was considered dangerous for the soul, and the discipline of work was thought to be spiritually beneficial. The evenings brought more prayers, then sleep. The dormitory would fill with the sounds of coughing, groaning, the restless movements of those in pain. Sleep must have been difficult, surrounded by the evidence of what the disease could do. Lying next to people in more advanced stages than yourself, knowing that their present was your future. Even among the outcast, hierarchies emerged. The leprosarium was not a community of equals. Distinctions of wealth, gender, and disease status created layers within the leper population. Wealthy lepers had significant advantages. Those who arrived with money or property could purchase better accommodations, a private room rather than the common dormitory, better food, more attentive care. Some wealthy lepers endowed the very leprosariums that housed them, funding construction or providing ongoing income in exchange for comfortable retirement in their affliction. That poor lepers had much harder lives. Those without resources entered the common dormitories, ate the common food, had no special treatment. If the leprosarium was poorly funded, they might face hunger, cold, neglect. The disease that united all lepers did not erase the class distinctions that divided medieval society. Gender created another division. Some leprosariums housed only men, others only women. Still others were mixed, but with separate facilities. Female lepers faced particular challenges. Concerns about sexual morality led to especially strict rules, and women who were alone in the world before their diagnosis might find themselves even more vulnerable in the leprosarium. The stage of the disease also created hierarchy. Newly arrived lepers, still showing minimal symptoms, occupied a different position than those whose faces and limbs had been consumed by the illness. The newer arrivals might still hope for misdiagnosis, for recovery, for some miracle. Those in advanced stages had no such hope. They knew how their story would end. Leadership positions existed in most leprosariums, a master or warden who oversaw operations, senior residents who helped maintain order, officers responsible for specific tasks. These positions carried modest privileges and represented the limited social mobility available within the walls. To understand life in a leper colony, you need to understand the disease that brought people there. Leprosy, now called Hansen's disease, after the doctor who identified its bacterial cause in 1873, is a chronic infection that primarily affects the skin, peripheral nerves, and mucous membranes. The bacterium Mycobacterium leprae grows very slowly, which is why leprosy develops over years rather than days. The incubation period can be anywhere from several months to 20 years, meaning that by the time symptoms appeared, a medieval person might have been infected for decades without knowing it. The disease manifests in different forms depending on the patient's immune response. At one end of the spectrum, tuberculoid leprosy causes a few skin patches and limited nerve damage. At the other end, lepromatous leprosy involves widespread skin involvement, extensive nerve damage, and potential effects on eyes, nose, and other organs. Most patients fall somewhere in between. The nerve damage is perhaps the most significant aspect. Leprosy attacks the peripheral nerves, particularly those close to the skin surface. This causes numbness, the inability to feel pain, temperature, or touch in affected areas. The numbness might seem like it would reduce suffering, but it actually increases it because patients can injure themselves without realizing it. Medieval observers didn't understand any of this, of course. They saw the visible effects, the skin patches, the nodules, the eventual deformities, and interpreted them through the lens of their religious worldview. They believed leprosy was highly contagious, which isn't really true. The disease actually requires prolonged close contact to spread, and many people are naturally immune. But the fear was real, and the fear shaped everything. The paradox of leprosy is that it combines pain and numbness, often in the same patient. This combination created unique suffering that was hard for healthy observers to understand. The numbness came from nerve damage. As the bacteria destroyed the nerve fibers, the ability to feel disappeared. A leper might burn their hand on a cooking fire and not notice. They might step on a sharp stone and keep walking, the wound worsening with every step. They might develop a blister that rubbed into an ulcer that deepened into an infection, all without the warning signals that pain normally provides. This anesthesia was not a blessing. Pain exists for a reason. It protects us, warns us, makes us remove our hand from the fire. Without pain, the body accumulates damage. Medieval lepers developed terrible injuries, not primarily from the disease itself, but from the secondary effects of not being able to feel. Burns, cuts, infections, pressure sores, all the wounds that healthy people avoid automatically. But the numbness was not complete or constant. Leprosy also causes neuritis, inflammation of the nerves, which produces severe pain. A leper might have a limb that couldn't feel external touch, but screamed with internal burning, shooting pains that came and went unpredictably. The damaged nerves misfired, creating sensations that had no external cause. The psychological effect of this combination was profound. You couldn't trust your body. Parts of it felt nothing. Parts of it felt agony. You might injure yourself without knowing, then suffer terribly from the consequences. Your own flesh became alien, unreliable, dangerous. Add to this the visible progression of deformities, and you begin to understand why lepers often seem to withdraw into themselves, disconnecting from bodies that had become sources of confusion and suffering. If you're settling in for sleep, subscribe and leave a comment about what dark historical topic you'd like me to cover next. Because now we need to discuss what happened to lepers' bodies over time. The wounds accumulated. Without the ability to feel pain, lepers injured themselves, constantly small injuries at first, then larger ones. Then injuries that refused to heal and became chronic sources of infection and deterioration. Hands and feet were particularly vulnerable. These extremities, constantly in use, constantly exposed to trauma, bore the brunt of the damage. A leper might hit their finger with a hammer and not feel it, then continue using the injured hand until the damage was severe. They might walk on feet that developed pressure sores, then ulcers, then deep wounds that exposed bone. Secondary infections were the real killers. Medieval people didn't understand bacteria, didn't have antibiotics, couldn't prevent wounds from becoming infected. Once infection set in, it spread. Osteomyelitis, infection of the bone, developed in chronic wounds. Gangrene rotted tissue. Sepsis poisoned the blood. The classic deformities of leprosy, the claw hand, the shortened fingers, the collapsed nose, the foot drop resulted from a combination of nerve damage, bone absorption, and chronic infection. The bones themselves could be affected, gradually absorbing, shortening, disappearing. A leper might lose fingers, not through dramatic amputation, but through slow absorption. The bones simply vanishing over years. Life in the leprosarium meant watching this happen, not just to yourself, but to everyone around you. The newer arrivals saw their future in the veteran lepers. The veterans saw their past in the newer arrivals. The progression was different for each person, faster for some, slower for others, but the direction was always the same, downward, toward increasing disability, increasing dependence, eventual death. Medieval medicine had nothing that actually worked against leprosy, but that didn't stop physicians from trying. A variety of treatments were applied, some based on medical theory, some on religious belief, none on any real understanding of the disease. Bloodletting was standard for almost any condition in medieval medicine, and leprosy was no exception. The theory was that illness resulted from an imbalance of the bodily humor's blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile, and that removing blood could restore balance. Lepers were bled regularly, a treatment that did nothing for their disease and may have weakened them further. Herbal remedies were applied to the skin and sometimes taken internally. Some of these were genuinely soothing ointments that kept wounds moist, poultices that reduced inflammation. Others were useless or harmful. The theriac, a concoction containing dozens of ingredients including opium, was sometimes prescribed. The opium might have relieved pain, but the rest did nothing. Dietary restrictions were common. Lepers were often forbidden certain foods thought to worsen their condition: pork, spicy foods, wine. Whether this had any effect is doubtful, but the restrictions were enforced nonetheless, adding yet another constraint to the leper's already limited existence. Baths were sometimes recommended, both for hygiene and for therapy. Some leprosariums had bathhouses where residents could soak in warm or medicated water. The baths may have helped prevent secondary infections and certainly improved comfort, even if they did nothing for the underlying disease. Spiritual treatments were at least as important as physical ones. Prayers, masses, pilgrimages, relics, these were considered powerful medicine. A leper might travel to a shrine, hoping for miraculous cure, or apply water that had touched a saint's relics. These treatments didn't cure leprosy either, but they provided hope, which was perhaps the most important medicine of all. Religion dominated life in the leprosarium. In a world that understood leprosy as divine punishment or divine favor, the spiritual care of lepers was considered essential, perhaps more important than their physical care. The chapel was the heart of the leprosarium, both architecturally and spiritually. It was often the largest and finest building, reflecting the community's priorities. Lepers might live in rough dormitories, but they worshipped in beautiful spaces adorned with paintings, carvings, and all the visual vocabulary of medieval Christianity. But even in their own chapel, lepers were often separated. Some leprosarium chapels had a dividing wall, with lepers on one side and any healthy visitors, priests, donors, officials, on the other. The lepers could hear the Mass, but couldn't see the altar, or could see it only through special openings. Small windows designed to provide a glimpse of the sacred mysteries. The leper window, or hagioscope, became a distinctive architectural feature. These small openings allowed lepers to watch the elevation of the host, the moment when the bread was transformed into Christ's body, without entering the healthy section of the church. The window was a compromise. Lepers needed access to the sacraments for their salvation, but they couldn't be allowed to contaminate the sacred space. Receiving communion presented another challenge. The priest couldn't touch the leper, couldn't place the host directly on their tongue. Special long-handled spoons or tongs were developed, allowing the priest to deliver the Eucharist from a safe distance. The leper received Christ's body while being treated as too contaminated to touch the priest's hand. For devout lepers, this worship through windows and at a distance must have been bittersweet. They remained connected to the church, to God, to the hope of salvation. But they were reminded with every Mass that they were not fully part of the congregation. not truly welcome in God's house, not clean enough to approach the altar. Leprosy didn't simply affect individuals. It tore apart families. The rules governing lepers' family relationships varied by time and place, but separation was almost always involved. When one spouse was diagnosed with leprosy, the marriage faced a crisis. In some jurisdictions, leprosy was grounds for dissolution. A healthy spouse could leave, freed from the obligation to remain with someone legally dead. In other places, the marriage remained technically valid, but the leper spouse was still required to live in the leprosarium. Separated indefinitely, some healthy spouses chose to follow their partners into exile. These devoted wives or husbands gave up their own freedom to remain with the person they had married. They lived in or near the leprosarium, caring for their afflicted spouse, eventually often contracting the disease themselves. Such devotion was praised by the church, held up as an example of Christian love. Children presented agonizing situations. Lepers were typically forbidden any contact with children, their own included. A mother diagnosed with leprosy might never hold her children again, might watch them grow up from behind the leprosarium walls, might become a stranger to them. Some children were sent to relatives. Others were placed in orphanages. Some grew up in poverty if no one would take them. Remarkably, some lepers married each other within the leprosariums. These marriages between people who were both afflicted created families within the exile community. Children were born to leper parents, growing up in the leprosarium, often contracting the disease themselves. These children knew no other life. The colony was their world, its residence, their community. If you're still listening, subscribe and leave a comment, because now we're going to discuss the lepers who entered the historical record, including at least one king. Baldwin IV of Jerusalem stands as the most famous leper in medieval history. Diagnosed with leprosy as a child his, Tudor noticed that the young prince felt no pain when other boys pinched and scratched him. Baldwin nonetheless became king at 13 and ruled. During some of the most dramatic years of the Crusades, Baldwin fought Saladin, the great Muslim leader, from horseback even as his body deteriorated. He led troops into battle when he could barely grip the reins, when his face was hidden behind a mask because his appearance had become too disturbing. He ruled with intelligence and determination until his death at 24. His body largely consumed by the disease, but his mind and will intact. The Leper King became a legendary figure, proof that leprosy did not automatically disqualify someone from greatness. But Baldwin's case was exceptional. In every way, he was royalty, supported by the finest care available, protected by his status. Most lepers had no armies, no kingdoms, no chroniclers to record their struggles. Other notable lepers included Robert the Bruce, King of Scotland, who may have had leprosy late in life, though the diagnosis is disputed. Various saints were associated with leprosy, either suffering from it themselves or becoming famous for their care of lepers. Saint Francis of Assisi's embrace of a leper was a defining moment in his conversion. These famous cases remind us that leprosy could strike anyone, rich or poor, noble or common, sinner or saint. The disease did not respect social boundaries, even if society tried to impose them after diagnosis. The medieval understanding of leprosy was inseparable from religion. The disease was not simply a physical affliction. It was a spiritual statement, a visible manifestation of invisible sin. This interpretation drew on biblical texts. Leviticus described procedures for identifying and isolating those with leprosy, though the Hebrew term covered various skin conditions, not just what we now call leprosy. The leper was declared unclean and required to live outside the camp, warning others with the cry, "Unclean, unclean." Medieval Christians saw continuity between these ancient laws and their own practices. The connection between leprosy and sin was made explicit in sermons, writings, and popular belief. Leprosy was thought to result from particular sin's lust, was commonly cited, since leprosy's disfigurements seemed to mirror the corruption of sexual sin. Pride, greed, heresy, various sins were proposed as causes, all agreeing that the disease was punishment. This interpretation placed a terrible burden on lepers. Not only did they suffer the physical effects of the disease, they also carried the imputation of sin. Others assumed they had done something terrible to deserve their fate. They might search their own pasts, tormented by guilt, wondering what they had done wrong. For family members, the diagnosis raised troubling questions. If leprosy was punishment, for sin, what did it say about a family that produced a leper? Were they all tainted? Had they failed to raise their child properly? The stigma spread beyond the individual leper to everyone associated with them. Even if a leper couldn't identify any particular sin, the theological interpretation was clear. God did not make mistakes. The disease itself was evidence of guilt, even if the specific crime remained unknown. This circular logic made it impossible for lepers to defend their moral character. Their bodies convicted them. But medieval Christianity held another, paradoxical view of leprosy. The leper might be not cursed, but specially blessed, suffering in this life to achieve glory in the next. This interpretation also drew on biblical sources. Jesus had healed lepers and commanded his followers to do the same. He had touched the untouchable, embraced the outcast, shown that the kingdom of God valued what the world rejected. The leper, in this reading, was an image of Christ himself suffering, despised, rejected, yet ultimately triumphant. The concept of the poor of Christ elevated lepers spiritually. Just as Christ had chosen poverty and suffering, lepers were forced into poverty and suffering, following Christ's path not by choice, but by circumstance. Their involuntary imitation of Christ's passion could be seen as a kind of martyrdom, purchasing heavenly reward through earthly torment. Some lepers embraced this interpretation as a source of meaning and dignity. If their suffering had spiritual value, it wasn't pointless. If they were closer to Christ because of their disease, they weren't simply cursed. The theological framework provided a way to understand their fate that didn't require accepting that they were uniquely sinful. This positive interpretation also encouraged charity toward lepers. If lepers were poor of Christ, serving them was serving Christ himself. The Gospel of Matthew promised that those who cared for the least of these were caring for Jesus. Wealthy patrons endowed leprosariums partly for the practical benefit, but also for the spiritual credit that came from serving the afflicted. Contradiction between leprosy as punishment and leprosy as blessing was never fully resolved. Both interpretations coexisted, applied differently to different people, emphasizing different aspects of the leper situation. The same person might be viewed as a punished sinner by one observer and as a suffering saint by another. Despite the fear and stigma, some people dedicated their lives to caring for lepers. These caregivers, monks, nuns, lay brothers, eventually. Professional staff embodied a different response to the disease than fear and exclusion. Religious orders often operated leprosariums. The Order of St. Lazarus, founded in the 12th century, specialized in caring for lepers. Its members were often lepers themselves, creating a community of the afflicted serving the afflicted. Other orders, Augustinians, Franciscans, various local communities, also took responsibility for leprosariums as an act of Christian charity. The caregivers lived among the lepers, touching them, feeding them, cleaning their wounds, all the intimate acts of care that the rules forbade to anyone else. They risked infection with every contact, though actually catching leprosy requires prolonged exposure, and many people are naturally immune. The courage required was real, based on the beliefs of the time. Some caregivers became famous for their devotion. St. Francis of Assisi's conversion began when he embraced a leper, overcoming his disgust to see Christ in the afflicted man. The story became paradigmatic an example of how Christians should respond to the outcast. Other saints were celebrated for similar acts of courageous charity. For the lepers themselves, these caregivers were often the only healthy people who would touch them, speak to them kindly, treat them as human beings rather than sources of contamination. The relationship between leper and caregiver could become profoundly meaningful, a connection that bridged the gap the rules had created. If you're settling in for sleep, subscribe and leave a comment, because now we need to discuss the end that awaited every resident of the leprosarium. Death came to all lepers eventually, often long before it would have come without the disease. Life expectancy in a leprosarium varied widely, but many residents died within a few years of diagnosis, while others survived for decades. The disease itself killed slowly. Its complications killed faster. The dying process was often prolonged and painful. As the disease progressed, secondary infections accumulated. Organs failed, the body simply wore out. Pain management was limited to what herbal remedies and prayers could provide. The dying leper might suffer for weeks or months before the end finally came. The community gathered around the dying, just as in any medieval death. Last rites were administered: confession, communion, extreme unction. Prayers were offered for the departing soul. The dying person was encouraged to make peace with God, to accept suffering as purification, to hope for the heaven that awaited. After death, the body was prepared for burial. This might be done by fellow lepers, by the religious staff of the leprosarium, by whoever was available. The body was washed, dressed in a shroud, laid out for a brief wake. The funeral mass was celebrated in the leprosarium chapel. Burial took place in the leprosarium cemetery, not in the parish churchyard, where the healthy dead rested, but in separate ground designated for lepers. Even in death, the separation continued. The lepers lay together, apart from the community that had cast them out, united in death as they had been in life. Leprosy had been endemic in Europe for centuries, when, in the 14th and 15th centuries, it began to decline. The leprosariums that had been full gradually emptied. By 1500, most European leprosariums had closed or been converted to other purposes. The disease that had terrified medieval Europe was fading away. The reasons for this decline remained somewhat mysterious. The Black Death of 1348 to 1350 killed perhaps a third of Europe's population, and some historians suggest it preferentially killed lepers who were already weakened and living in close quarters where plague could spread easily. Others suggest that the plague simply killed so many people that leprosy lost its reservoir of hosts. But another theory points to tuberculosis. TB is caused by a bacterium related to the leprosy bacterium. An infection with TB may provide some immunity to leprosy. As tuberculosis became more common in Europe, perhaps, as populations urbanized, it may have pushed leprosy out, occupying the same ecological niche. Improved living conditions might also have played a role. Leprosy spreads through prolonged close contact, typically within households. As the medieval period ended and living conditions slowly improved, better housing, better nutrition, less crowding, the opportunities for transmission may have decreased. Whatever the cause, the decline was dramatic. Leprosariums that had housed hundreds now house dozens, and handfuls than none. The great fear that had shaped medieval society's response to the disease began to ease. Leprosy was becoming a memory, an image in paintings, a character in stories, rather than a living threat thought. As leprosy declined, the leprosariums faced an uncertain future. These institutions, built and endowed to care for lepers, found themselves with fewer and fewer patients. What would become of them? Some leprosariums simply closed. The buildings fell into disrepair, were demolished, or were incorporated into other structures. The land was sold or repurposed. The memory of what the site had been faded, leaving only occasional archaeological traces or documentary references. Others were converted to new purposes. A leprosarium's infrastructure, dormitories, chapel, kitchen, could serve other populations. Some became hospitals for other conditions. Some became almshouses for the poor, maintaining their charitable function while changing their clientele. Some became prisons, their walls in isolation serving new forms of confinement. A few leprosariums survived as institutions, continuing to house the small number of lepers who remained and gradually accepting patients with other chronic conditions. These evolved over centuries into general hospitals, their leprosarium origins forgotten or obscured dot the endowments that had supported. Leprosariums sometimes became the subject of legal disputes. Who owned the property now that the original purpose couldn't be fulfilled? Donors' families, local churches, municipal governments, various parties claimed the assets. These disputes could drag on for generations. The empty leprosariums stood as monuments to a fear that had passed. For centuries, these places had housed the living dead, the walking reminders of sin and mortality. Now they stood silent, their purpose completed or abandoned, waiting to be absorbed back into the normal world they had been built to separate. Leprosy may have faded from Europe, but its legacy persisted. The word leper became an insult, a metaphor for anyone cast out and rejected. The stigma outlived the disease by centuries. The medieval response to leprosy established patterns that would reappear with other diseases. Isolation, exclusion, visible marking of the afflicted. These techniques were applied to plague victims, to those with syphilis, to tuberculosis patients, to anyone whose illness frightened healthy society. The leprosarium was the ancestor of the sanatorium, the isolation hospital. The quarantine camp taught the assumption that disease indicated moral failing also persisted. Tuberculosis in the 19th century, AIDS in the 20th, both were initially interpreted through moral lenses. Their sufferers blamed for their condition just as lepers had been blamed. The connection between illness and sin proved remarkably durable. Modern science eventually explained what leprosy actually was. In 1873, Gerhard Armauer Hansen identified the bacterium that causes the disease, which is now called Hansen's disease in recognition. The disease is curable with antibiotics, though some damage already done cannot be reversed. It is far less contagious than medieval people believed, and many people are naturally immune. Yet stigma persists even today. In parts of the world where leprosy still occurs, primarily in tropical regions, patients face discrimination, rejection, social exclusion. The medieval fear has not entirely disappeared. It has merely relocated. Those working to combat leprosy today fight not just the bacterium, but the centuries of stigma that still surround the disease. The medieval lepers are long dead, their names mostly forgotten, their suffering absorbed into history. But their story continues to matter as a case study in how societies treat the sick, how fear shapes policy, how theology and medicine intertwine. The bells no longer ring, but their echo remains not, and so our time in the leprosarium comes to an end. The buildings are ruins now, where they exist at all. The bells have been silent for 500 years. The gray cloaks have rotted away. The separate graves have been reclaimed by earth and time. The small windows through which lepers once watched the mass have been bricked up or fallen in. Medieval leprosy has become history, archaeology, footnotes in medical textbooks. But for centuries, this was real life for thousands of people. They woke each morning in the leprosarium dormitory, surrounded by others whose bodies were failing in the same slow, visible way. They prayed in chapels where they were reminded of their separation even from God's house. They watched themselves deteriorate day by day, month by month, year by year, knowing there would be no cure, no recovery, no return to the lives they had lost. The cruelty of the medieval response to leprosy is obvious to modern eyes. We know now that the disease is not very contagious, that most people are immune, that thessalation and stigma were far in excess of what the actual risk required. The funeral while still alive, the rules forbidding any contact, the bell that announced contamination, all of this was based on fear and misunderstanding rather than medical necessity. But we should be careful about judging too harshly. Medieval people didn't have germ theory, didn't have microscopes, didn't have any way to know how diseases actually spread. They saw the horrible effects of leprosy, the disfigurement, the disability, the slow death, and they were terrified. Their response was shaped by that terror, amplified by religious interpretations that saw disease as divine punishment or test. And we should ask ourselves, are we really so different? When new diseases emerge, don't we see similar patterns? The fear, the exclusion, the assumption that the sick have done something to deserve their fate? HIV, COVID, whatever comes next each, has brought out both the best and worst of human response. The medieval leper has descendants in every generation. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, consider what it would mean to be declared dead while still alive. To have dirt thrown on your feet in your own funeral. To walk away from everything you knew, ringing a bell, warning everyone to stay away. To live among others who are suffering the same fate, watching your body slowly fail, waiting for the death that was years away, but certain. Consider the courage it took to survive that. To get up each morning, to pray, to work, to maintain some dignity and hope in a situation designed to strip both away. Many lepers found faith, found community, found meaning in their exile. They were not simply victims. They were human beings navigating impossible circumstances. The lepers are gone, but the questions they raise remain. How do we treat those whose bodies mark them as different? How do we balance protection of the healthy against dignity for the sick? What do we owe to those whom society wants to exclude? The bells are silent. The colonies are empty. But the echo of the leper's story still sounds. If we have ears to hear it not rest well. You are healthy. You are free. And no one is coming to declare you dead tomorrow. But remember those who are not so fortunate. Remember the living dead who walked to their exile wearing gray, ringing the bells that warned the world away. Remember that they were people loved, feared, forgotten, but always people. The bells are silent now. Sleep and be grateful.